Welcome to the Zinnov podcast, Decoding Private Equity series, where we bring to you in-depth conversations with practitioners and leaders on the hottest PE deals, their investment theses, and a lowdown on industries where all the action is.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Zinnov podcast, Decoding Private Equity series. I'm Nilesh Thakker, President of Zinnov and your host for the day. In this series, we take a closer look at companies owned by private equity firms. We explore their strategies, the challenges they face, and how technology plays a key role in driving their growth and resilience. Today, I'm honored to be joined by George Abatjoglou, President of EMS Management and Consultants. For over 2 decades, George has steered PE-backed healthcare companies towards explosive growth. His expertise lies in crafting, build, partner, or buy strategies that maximize profitability or market share. Leveraging financial acumen and operational leadership, George has built high-performing teams and led successful outcomes for multiple companies. I've known George for a few years and I've really enjoyed working with him and learning from him. Welcome to the Zinnov podcast, George.
Thanks, Nilesh. It's great to be here, and thanks for inviting me.
So, George, I'd like to start with a couple of questions. You've been doing this for a couple of decades. You have successfully set up RCM teams globally and particularly in India. Could you share how the process and strategies for establishing successful RCM operations in India have evolved? What were the major challenges you faced initially, and how have those challenges been addressed or changed over time?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the biggest things that's changed over time, especially in healthcare and revenue cycle as part of that, is the evolution of the electronic health record. When I first started establishing operations in India, which honestly was with third-party partners, a lot of that work was largely data entry, transactional work. And part of that was because there weren't sort of a high propensity of electronic health records available. What you were seeing was paper records being scanned and the need to index those scanned records into what they were, maybe find some content in there and put it into a system and that sort of activity. Now we're in 2024 and everybody has an electronic health record, and workflows are embedded into those electronic health records. And that really facilitates work from anywhere. I think the other thing that's changed over time has been the evolution of technology. Today we're doing this podcast and it's like we're sitting in the same room together, but in reality we're not. And that really wasn't something that existed in the early 2000s. I know Skype was the first one that we all used in a business setting. Mm-hmm. I think Microsoft totally sunset it. But the evolution of collaboration platforms, Teams in particular, as a way to do work is something that really made a global operation possible and really allowed you to start to think differently about how you approach RCM and bringing countries into the fold like India. And then I think the last thing that changed over that period was, I remember when I first started this, you were looking at partners like Wipro and big BPOs who had transactional processing experience, but not deep revenue cycle experience. And so you were having to be very selective about, one, who you partnered with, and two, what you gave them, because it was very difficult, given all those other things that I talked about, to teach them how to do a set of activities. Now, though, there's so many well-established companies that have revenue cycle operations. And what that's allowed to happen is two things. One is that there's a labor pool there available of trained resources who know revenue cycle that you can recruit from. But the other is the students, the young people, see this opportunity for a career path similar to what I imagine was happening back in the late 90s and early 2000s around software development and technology. And so kids are going to school and learning the skills to move into revenue cycle. And so you have this constant stream of new people coming into the workforce that creates a really ripe setting to establish an operation in India.
That's great insight. So, George, it seems like the technology has made things easier and you're able to interact, collaborate a lot more. Does that mean your expectations of what you can do from global locations has increased, and now you're able to provide more responsibility and ownership to your global teams and are able to get better outcomes? What are your thoughts on that?
Honestly, the only thing that we don't move to our global operation or to our India operation is patient-facing interactions. And part of that is just the sort of the ease of understanding of the dialect. Part of it, quite honestly, is just societal preferences. And I think there's a point in time where we're going to get past that, but we're frankly not there yet. So with the exception of that, though, every single function that we do in the company, we're able to do from any location globally, including our India operation. What that allows us to do is become very thoughtful, because there's some things that have a delay in the process. So something that happens, there's a step that has to happen first before the next step can happen. And so now we can look at the distribution of the workflow and think about it as a 24/5 operation and move those steps to the right place where everybody can continually be processing and working. And what that allows us to do is turn around what we do, which is bill and collect for transports in a very efficient manner, and reduce our cycle time for days to cash for our customers, which is ultimately what they care about. And I think that that's something that you're able to do now, partly because of technology and partly because of the sort of increased skill set of the labor force.
Okay. Man, I think you already mentioned some of the differences in approach and strategies required to set up successful RCM teams. Are there other things which you are now, for example, in the ones you did recently, you didn't even travel to the India office for almost a few months or a year almost after setting it up. I'm guessing that would not have been possible earlier. So it seems like you could almost do this without even travel. Is that a true assessment of what's possible now?
Companies have learned to operate remotely. That didn't exist before, right? Before the pandemic, we knew how to manage people, how to hire people, how to recruit, interview, train, etc. When they would come into the office and they would be in the cube next to you, or you'd go into your training room, etc. The pandemic forced us all to learn how to do it, some for a very short period of time because they were able or brought their employees back. But other organizations like mine changed our operating style. We have an office here that I'm in that has 50,000 square feet. And if there were 20 people that came to work here every day, I'd be surprised. And so recruit for talent, engage with talent, interview, onboard, train, all remotely. And so I view the India operation no different than when I hire a batch here. We do the same thing that we do in India. We start a class every 2 weeks. We start them in the US every 2 weeks, and we bring them through the training program, and that's been virtualized now, and make them feel part of the organization and connected to the organization. So the hardest part about establishing the operation in India and not going there in person, we didn't have anybody go there from the day that we said go, that we want to do this. For, if I remember correctly, it was 4 months before our first person showed up there on site.
Right.
And in order to do that, we needed a partner to help us. You do need boots on the ground to find a facility to establish the initial part of the operation and that sort of thing. And we couldn't have done that without a partner in the process. But outside of that, the people part, we could do remotely, and we did. And it's a lot of it is because companies have learned to do it remotely. I would say if you're a company that all of your people go to the office every day and you haven't learned how to manage, people remotely, and then whether you're opening an office in India or you're opening an office in middle of nowhere, Montana, you're going to have a challenge because you got to first learn that muscle memory of how to engage employees and train employees in a remote fashion.
Okay. One other thing in my experience when I talk to leaders is they tend to feel that when I'm setting up global operations, my productivity is not going to be high enough. So one of the things I wanted to ask you was, when outsourcing RCM operations, and again globally and particularly India, what factors do you considering in determining the optimal team size? Mm-hmm. How do you strike the balance between having a team large enough to handle the workload efficiently, but also maintaining the quality and cost effectiveness? Because if you're going to hire more people than what you would hire back home, then you're obviously losing some of that product. So right. What have you considered?
Yeah, no, it's a valid point. And I think the honest answer is that we have the same productivity standards for the US and for India. We don't have a difference in those. And it admittedly has taken a little longer to get people to those productivity standards because our industry is a very niche-y part of healthcare. And so they had to learn kind of the nichiness part of it. When we started the operation, if you think about it, we hired our first class, I think was 30 people. The next class was 50 people. And they had no peers that knew anything about the business. They didn't know anything about what we do. When you're coming into an organization, you're learning from your peers that are sitting beside you kind of virtually or in person, and they didn't have that benefit. Now, I think we're just shy of 400 people, about half of which now have been with the organization for over 3 months in a production capacity. And so they're starting to get that sort of critical mass of knowledge there. And we're seeing the time to get them to the sort of company standard has shortened as a result of that. But it's been very intentional focus. And our focus has been first on quality. Like we knew we could, because of the difference in the cost of resources in India versus the US, we could allow them to have a bit more time to get to the production level as long as the quality was there and we weren't having any issues from a customer outcome perspective. And so we were fortunate in that. But now, like I said, as we're getting more and more people up to speed, there are also new people coming in are getting to that productivity level faster. But net is we hold them to the same standards as we do in the US.
That's great. So many times I've answered that question, that how much productivity loss, and it seemed like it's at par, and that's important. So.
Right. And doing this, like you said, for I think almost 15 years now, where there was productivity loss in the beginning was really more in the oversight because of the tools weren't there, the systems weren't there, and the resources didn't know revenue cycle as much as they do now. There was a lot of resource requirement on the US to stay on top of and close to the resources in the offshore operation. And so what you were seeing was where the cost may be here versus here, US to offshore. Once you started to layer in the increased cost of oversight and management because you needed to overcompensate, they started to get closer. Right now, you don't have that anymore. It's just it's a different dynamic there, and so that part of it has gone away.
Okay, and you were able to, as you just mentioned, you are already at 400 people in a few months, which is a pretty impressive. You started from 0 to 400 in like almost 10 months. We call it 0 to 60 in cars, but like 0 to 400 in 10 months. Could you elaborate the reasons of going so fast and the need for rapid scaling?
Yeah. There were a couple of things that sort of drove the decision to go and establish our own center. One was that when I got here, I learned that we had almost over 50% of our workforce was actually offshore, but they were with a couple of third-party vendors. As I sat there and thought about it, I was like, well, you're going to create a better customer experience when you're connected to the customer as the employee. If the employee is with a third-party BPO, they're one step removed, right? They're connected to the customer who then serves the customer, and that sort of engagement level doesn't exist. So that was one reason to want to do it. The other compelling event for us was we rolled out a new platform. And so we were going to have to either train what was over 500 third-party vendor employees on a new platform as we migrated our customers to that new platform, which was going to be a challenge and have all the complexities of rolling out a new platform. Or we could use that as kind of the compelling event to establish our center, get everybody up. And then as we convert customers into the new platform, we would use our new employees to do that. And I would just wind down the third party. And so what that caused us to have to do then is really accelerate the hiring and the ramping, probably at a level, I will admit, it made my leadership team uncomfortable when I told them that's what we were going to do. But I think, it's been successful. And the other part of it is we had acquired a bunch of businesses. And so we were going to integrate those businesses into the new system. And so what we've been doing now is as we've integrated the businesses into the new system, it's been our new employees, MedExpert, who are the ones that are doing that work. The last thing that we're moving into the last phase, which is we're going to wind down the work that the BPOs are doing and move that into our operation. So we had that as our driving factor. And it's good that we did, because sometimes organizations need a thing, like they need an event that's forcing them to make the decision and move fast. Otherwise, you're going to dip your toe in, do 10, 20, 30, 50 people, whatever it may be, and not really kind of figure out how can you really accelerate it. So I've been very happy with how things have gone.
That's great. So any strategies or considerations that you have learned and you could share with the listeners on what you did, or something maybe you would not do again, or something which you can share tips when you're going that fast? What are the things which you have learned over time?
I would say that the number one thing that we did, and the most important thing, is I look back at like, how did we get to where we are this quickly and frankly as successfully as we have? Were two hires. One was the country head, and we're a private equity owned company. I was told by my sponsor when it said that this was going to be an important hire, the consultants that we used, it was going to be an important hire. And it was, and we found a great country head, and that made all the difference, because the person had experience in establishing centers multiple times, 2 different organizations, both revenue cycle, but also experience running at scale. That was one. The other thing is we were very thoughtful about the initial set of leaders. Like those were our number one hires, the director of the operation, and then that individual's managers were the things that we really honed in on, what the requirements were, the type of people. And once we had that core organization in place, we knew from that point, then they'd be able to build behind them. So that was one. The other was we invested a lot of US resources in going there and making those initial set of employees feel part of the organization and feel committed. We were there for their first day. We took the first 2 classes through their first 2 weeks of orientation. And what it did is allowed a couple things. One, they felt very connected and supported by the organization. They built their relationships with their US counterparts so that they could reach out if they needed help and they feel connected. But the other is we established what the standard was going to be as we were going to bring new people in and kind of laid that groundwork for them, and then allowed them to modify it a little bit for what they want to do, but ultimately knowing that they're doing it in a way that sort of supports where we need the outcome to be 2-4 weeks into onboarding.
Okay. And one last question, and you're part, as you mentioned earlier, you're part of a private equity portfolio company. How has the involvement with the private equity helped you or enabled you to do this faster? Would you encourage other private equity companies to let the companies do this, or any thoughts on that?
So they've been very supportive. I believe that the firm had 1 or 2 other scenarios where they had established a center, albeit on the tech side. So one of their technology companies established a tech center, so not on service organization. We use tech, but we're largely a services organization. So they had some resources that I could talk to who had done it before within the portfolio, which was helpful for me as I was thinking through the beginning of it. But largely they were just there for support from the perspective of capital. There's a fair amount of capital cost up front when, especially a center our size, right? We 25,000 square foot facility. Now it's going to be almost 40,000. There's capital to get that up and running, and they need to be there to support that investment. But outside of that, they were really just there as a support, and a little bit kind of like the rest of the team. They were a little bit amazed at the pace that we went at it with. My feeling now is, having done what we've done within the portfolio, and actually I have done this, like we've spoken about, we do various, like many of these PE firms do, they'll have a focus group where they allow one individual who's done something within the portfolio to kind of present it to the rest of the portfolio leadership so that they can think about it. And we're talking about doing that with respect to establishing a center offshore.
Okay, great. As we just heard, George has been through this journey before, and according to him, things have changed and much for the better. He's able to now scale teams pretty fast. He's done 400 people in 10 months, and ability to create the same level of productivity and quality which he's expecting from his teams in the US. Thank you, George, for sharing your perspective with us. Really appreciate your time today. So,
yeah, my pleasure, Nilesh. Thank you.
And thank you all for turning into this episode. We'll be back soon with another episode on ideas to learn from leaders like George who have been able to do this successfully. Take care, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to the Zinnov podcast Decoding Private Equity series. We hope you enjoyed listening in and found the information shared here useful. You can listen to the other episodes of this podcast series on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Or just visit our website www.zinnov.com or drop us a note at info@zinnov.com to know more.